What's next is going to depend on kind of the response to the book. But I'm excited that, you know, I gave it, all you can do is give something your best shot. And I know I gave this my best shot, both as to the writing of the book and promoting the book, and we'll just see where it goes. But since my best friend in the whole world, Marvin Blum, is here, traveled from Fort Worth, I thought about this today, Marvin, that if I had been elected president of the student body at the University of Texas in the spring of 1975, my plan was to just take an extra year of college. I wasn't going to possibly start law school and try to be student body president. And if that had happened, Marvin Blum and I would not have been roommates. And we were roommates all 3 years of law school, and we've been best friends ever since. And so thank God for that unanswered prayer, because that's, amen. Oh, you got one here? Ken.
Talmage, you made the comment that you didn't show the questions to any of your interview subjects. I was curious, did any of your interview subjects ask to see the questions beforehand?
Only one did, and I talked to that person's handler and explained how in an onstage interview, if you want to really have a high level of energy, there's got to be spontaneity. And so I showed the questions to the handler so that they could see there was no trick questions, nothing weird. It was, you know, all totally tied to the book. And the handler said, yeah, this is fine. He'll be fine. And it was great. So for the most part, these people who do these types of events, they don't want to know the questions. They want to be surprised. They want a chance to think of something new. They don't want to give canned responses. And particularly, and this, if you listen to the radio, you realize that it's, so many of the interviews are conducted by people who have not read the book. And so their questions are not very deep. And they knew that, and Ken Burns forward in the book kind of goes into this, that, you know, the really good people like challenging questions because it really brings something out in them that they maybe hadn't thought about before, and that's always fun when you're doing something new. Lane? Lincoln had the biggest challenge, the country divided, hugest issue in our country's history, what to do with slavery, presided over a war where over 700,000 people were killed, which based on the population, if that were to happen today, it'd be several million of our people killed. And yet he never lost his vision, he never lost his courage, he never lost his compassion, he never lost his brilliance. And he had, you know, a strange wife, and he lost a child who died in the White House. He had all kinds of personal tragedy amidst all this national tragedy, and yet he piloted the ship through the storm and brought us out, you know, to where we were unified once again. And every historian has always said if he had not been shot, Reconstruction would have gone a whole lot better, because he was just, I mean, to me, one of the most amazing, here's Lincoln, who had less than 1 year of formal education. He becomes president of the United States, and all of a sudden there's a civil war going on. All of a sudden, all these Union generals are West Point grad. He assumes they know how to fight a war. And they don't. And they're cowards. And so Lincoln has to go to the Library of Congress and study military history. And pretty soon he's smarter than all of them except for U.S. Grant.
We have one in the balcony. We have one in the balcony. Talmage, up in the balcony.
Up in the balcony.
I'll defer to the balcony.
The greatest aha moment came with John F. Kennedy. And the reason is the guy who I interviewed on John F. Kennedy was the historian in residence at the Kennedy Presidential Library for 22 years. And in that capacity, he was during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the meetings of the Brain Trust, Kennedy and his top advisors, were called the ExComm meetings, Executive Committee meetings. And JFK and Robert had decided they wanted those meetings to be tape recorded, but they didn't tell anybody else. And so they recorded, but they were kept confidential for years and years and years. And presumably the Kennedy brothers were like Nixon. They thought, well, these tapes will always be our property. They will never go into the public domain. Well, of course, Kennedy, the Cuban Missile Crisis was in early '63, and then JFK was killed in November, and then in 68, or before 68, RFK decided he was going to run for president. And so he said, okay, well, how can I make myself a big hero? Aha! I can make myself the hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I can write 13 Days, and I can tell everybody that I was the cool head who kept the country out of World War III, and blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, Robert Kennedy was shot, and then Ted Sorensen, the Kennedy flunky, historian or journalist, he was the guy who wrote Profiles in Courage. But anyway, he picked up where RFK, and so they created this book called 13 Days, New York Times bestseller, that made it sound like Robert F. Kennedy was the hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that he'd been the cool head in the room. And my biographer, Sheldon Stern, who was the first guy to listen to all 42 and a half hours of the tape, says, that's ridiculous. R.F. Kennedy was the hawk. He was the guy who was wanting us to retaliate big time against Cuba and start World War III. And the only cool head in the room was John F. Kennedy. And so that's an aha moment, because you always, if you've seen the movie 13 Days, or if you've, and of course Arthur Schlesinger, another Kennedy family lackey, had blessed 13 Days, and then he even allegedly listened to the tapes and said that they confirmed what the book 13 Days had been, which was ridiculous because it was the total opposite. So, I mean, that's why for each of these historians, I wanted to, feel like I was getting the best minds, the best information, and no, redoing of history along somebody's political agenda.
Gentleman in the center of the balcony's been standing up all time. We have one more question.
Say it again. That's what you call a loaded question. The question is, what do I think about the head of the FBI who yesterday announced that although he did not think that any prosecutor would pursue an indictment against Hillary Clinton with respect to the emails, nonetheless, he laid out chapter and verse the many different specifics of what Hillary had been saying publicly for the last year, in fact, was in many cases totally false. And so I will answer your question by saying that I want everybody in this audience to buy my book. And we got 100 of them, and if I come down and say, well, the guy did a great thing or the guy did a stupid thing, that will alienate some of the people in this crowd. So I am going to say, I'm going to let we all have so much access to so much information that we get to form our own opinions. And since this is the last question, I guess I will close with this thought that, oh, it's not. I said, okay, well, we'll come, Jack. We'll come, Jack. But anyway, this election is causing all kinds of ill will among people who used to like each other. And to me, what a shame. Neither of these candidates is worth fracturing a friendship and yet it's happening all over the place. And so I have friends who support the two presumptive nominees, and I try to maintain civil discourse. But I've finally decided, you know what? I'm going to go radio silent because I don't want to lose any friends. I don't want to alienate, and because people are so hyped up because, either they listen to Fox every night or they listen to MSNBC every night or they read the New York Times, they read the Wall Street Journal, and God knows what on the internet. And so everybody's just in such a hyped up frame of mind and so hyper certain about the wisdom and, brilliance of their position that they can't even begin to think of the other side. And free country, you get to do what you want, but to thine own self be true. And I'm just going to talk about the past presidents Jack?
Yeah. Talmage, I think you've gone radio silent, so I don't know if you'll answer this, but let's look out 15, 20 years from now.
Nobody's that smart.
You'll be in your 80s. You're the same age as I am. And let's say you're still doing this, and it's time for a second edition. Looking at today's race, we'll have a new president in the fall, inaugurated in the first of the year. 20 years from now, whoever that is, what kind of questions would you pose to those candidates themselves or their advisors or their biographers?
Jack, I love you. I love you. But I'm going to ask questions based on what happened. What happens in the next 20 years? And I have no idea what's going to happen in the next 20 years. When you think about President George W. Bush, he ran for office, had a platform, had an agenda, knew what he wanted to do, and we have 9/11. Everything's skewed. So you can't know what to ask the questions about until you know what the issues are, and we can't know the issues because the world is changing so fast and in so unpredictably. You know, I just hope that, to try to be somewhat respectful here, that I'll try to understand the man or the woman themselves and what the issues were and what the differing viewpoints on the issues were based on, and use that as a springboard for trying to gain a deeper understanding than I got from the newspapers or on TV at the time, because that is what history does do for you. It allows you to look back with 20/20 hindsight. You know what's happened. You know what evolved from their decisions. And you can get to second guess them or suggest some things that they should have been thinking about that they weren't be thinking about, that in fact were there for them to be thinking about. You know, kind of like LBJ in Vietnam. If he's so focused on civil rights, was he really? And he had not been a foreign policy guy in Congress. In his many years in Congress, he'd been a domestic policy guy. He accepts all of Kennedy's so-called foreign policy experts. They lead him down the path toward high escalation of the Vietnam War, and it's a disaster. And so I'm just trying to keep up with today, and I can't even. It's all happening so fast today. But above all, the one thing you learn from history is nobody's got a very good crystal ball. And but the other thing you learn that I guess will be my last statement, and that is that history teaches us how much things change and how much things stay the same. And what I hope comes across in the book is that the great presidents that we've had have specific presidential leadership traits that we should all aspire to elect in the different races during our lifetime, whether it's the high integrity of George Washington, the capacity to cross the aisle and build consensus like Thomas Jefferson, the capacity to surround yourself with top leaders and advisors who are strong in the areas where you're weak, like James Madison, the capacity to overcome major obstacles like Franklin Roosevelt. That's really what I'm trying to do with this book. And after I get through the 31 interviews, the last chapter is called Closing Thoughts, where I do detail these 10 commandments of presidential leadership, and I also have 9 conclusions about kind of what the state of the presidency is today and what the state of evaluating presidents is today. So I did try to draw it together with summarizing what I consider to be the main points from the interviews, but each of the interviews is really fascinating because I'm talking to the top people who've done the years of researching and have just written it better than anybody. And so I think you'll really enjoy the book. Thank you very much.